Live reporters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists. This is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
Welcome into this week's edition of Tracking the Tropics. Although the tropics are quiet at the moment, we actually have a great episode planned for you today. Thanks for joining us on this edition. I'm your host, meteorologist Amanda Hawley, joined alongside your other host, Rebecca Berry, here in the WFLA Weather Center. And we also have our featured meteorologist of the day, chief meteorologist from WGNO, Hank Allen, a very familiar face of the program, has been joining us for several years now. Thanks for being with us today, Hank.
You know, always a pleasure to be with you guys. It's always more fun when there's something to talk about.
It is.
You know, I guess we'll accept a boring day for now.
For now, right? Still early on in the season. Yeah. I think there won't be too many more of these episodes where we can look at this map and it's completely quiet. So today we are going to be talking a little bit, though, about why it's been so quiet since Beryl's demise last week and how long we do expect it to stay quiet. So, Rebecca, we, of course, will be taking everyone's questions with our hashtag system.
Yes. And so if you want to weigh in, we want to hear from you. If you have questions about the tropics, questions that have been on your mind, in order for us to see your comment, we do need you to use a hashtag. And the hashtags are below our name on the screen. You can use hashtag Hey Rebecca, hashtag Hey Amanda, or hashtag Hey Hank. And we'll be able to see those comments, bring them on screen, and answer them for you.
So I think a lot of the questions that I've personally gotten over the past couple of days are just, how long are we going to, be in this little quieter phase? Ooh. Because we started out quiet, and then we got, 3 storms, 1, 2, 3, and then it's been a little quiet. And actually, this map says, no new development expected over the next 7 days, but really it could be more like 14 days, possibly into early August here, because we're just in a very unfavorable environment at the moment. So we have a lot of that Saharan dust out there that we love to talk about. We started out slow this season with the Saharan dust, but we've seen several thick plumes come across the Atlantic, and we are likely going to see another thick plume move into the Gulf of Mexico by this weekend, creating those pretty hazy skies. And then for some where it's a little thinner, those really pretty sunrises and sunsets. Rebecca, I know we got some here in the Tampa Bay area a few days ago, last weekend. Hank, did you guys see any of this dust moving into the New Orleans area where you're at?
Not yet. It's been sort of fading out before it gets all the way across the Gulf. You mentioned, though, the scope of this next batch coming across, so I would certainly anticipate getting some of that here over the next week or two. What's interesting is we've actually been, so hot and dry lately. Now we're actually going to get into some rain. It looks like over the next 7 days or so. So we may not even get a chance to really notice it that much because there'll be so much cloud cover. But, I have gotten emails from people before that talk about a little bit hard to breathe. As you guys know, some respiratory issues if you get enough of that in here. So, we probably won't mind the rain to help clear that out a little bit. But it does make for some beautiful sunrise and sunset opportunities, like you guys mentioned. I mean, it is really pretty when that stuff moves in. Haven't seen it much, though.
Haven't seen a ton of it move that far west. Now, here, last Thursday and Friday, we actually had air pollution advisories because the plume was so thick. And it was so thick that our skies were just incredibly hazy. We really didn't even see too much of a sunrise or a sunset because it was so thick 1 or 2 of the days. It was like a 36-hour period where you're like, where's the sky? But then it started to thin out, and we got some really pretty pinks and oranges in a few of the sunsets over the weekend. But this plume that you're looking at on your screen right now is set to come in this weekend, and you can kind of see it moving across the Gulf there. But really the focus is that it's dry air, Hank, so it, helps to kind of squash any showers and thunderstorms that are out in the Atlantic that may otherwise develop and organize into a tropical system.
Yeah, the disappointment here is it's always this time of year, right? I mean, we never get this in early September. So I've got people here at the station that be like, well, I love to see that dust coming in. I'm like, yeah, but it's not going to be there September 10th probably when we need it to be. But certainly keeps things quiet in the interim. And, relatively speaking, it's been a quiet season overall. I mean, obviously we had Beryl. We know that record-setting storm in terms of early intensity, how far east it developed, all that, certainly an anomaly. But when you take that out of the equation, the other 2 storms were in the southwestern Gulf, barely formed before landfall. We haven't seen anything since Beryl. We're not going to see anything, like you said, over the next 7 to 10 days. So relatively speaking, a very quiet start to the season, I think, if you can look past Beryl and the anomaly that was Beryl. Now, you can take that 2 ways. Either that indicates it's going to be extremely active because we saw Beryl and the ingredients were out there, and we can see what happens when those ingredients come together. Or, maybe it's a long way to go, obviously, but these predictions are certainly on the high end. And so if we stay quiet through the rest of July, things are really going to have to ramp up probably in August and September, which they're likely to do.
Yeah.
But really start to ramp up to start to get to some of those numbers, because Colorado State is, as you guys have on the screen there, just up their prediction, which was interesting to me. So
Yeah.
we've only had 3 so far. We're about where we have been over the past few years at this point, and so it was interesting that they upped that.
I was actually surprised they upped it by 2, that total number, because I was like, oh, that, the numbers were on track for it to be a hyperactive season. We had already had 3 by the time they were coming out with this update. So I was, saying, oh, it was 23 named storms prior to July 9th for Colorado State's update. And I said, oh, well, we've already had 3. So that kind of makes sense. We're on track. But then, yeah, they upped it by 2. So I wonder what NOAA, the National Hurricane Center, will do when they come out with their update, which is typically in early August.
The big range from NOAA. I always love that.
Yes.
Somewhere between a good and a bad season.
Yeah, right. We're going to get between 2 and 12 inches of snow tomorrow. Plan accordingly.
And
Yeah.
just to remind our viewers, this is interactive. You can ask a question using a hashtag, and we'll be able to pull it into our system. And we do have our first question, and it's using the hashtag Hey Amanda. And so we'll go ahead and let Amanda field this one. If you use a hashtag, we're able to see your question and pull it on screen. This one says, hashtag Hey Amanda, I've always wondered why all the hurricanes usually start off the coast of Africa. Can you explain why?
Sure, that is a great question, Dan. Thank you for your question. So a lot of the bigger, more memorable storms that we do get come off the coast of Africa because they start as tropical waves. So right now you're taking a look at a map that says no new development expected over the next 7 days. But if you look below that, near where it says Cape Verde and near the coast of Africa, there's some of the red colors. Those are clouds. Those are showers and thunderstorms coming off the coast. And what we see happen a little later on toward the peak of hurricane season, when we do normally get some of those stronger storms, is the tropical waves come off the coast. They feed off the warm waters coming all the way across the Atlantic. And if they can survive that trek, those are the storms that, sometimes end up being some of the stronger storms that end up, here in the United States or recurving out into the Atlantic. But they become a little bit stronger because we don't normally look to the coast of Africa for those tropical waves until peak season. Early on in the season, right now, June and July, we look a lot closer to home for that development. And I actually have one of those maps to show you here, because what we see happen are cold fronts come down. These quick spin-up storms can form off of these weak fronts. They don't usually last very long. Hank just talked about how Alberto and Chris were both very short-lived storms. They were not tropical waves that came off the coast of Africa. They were barely storms for 24 hours. And, heading into the next season, or if we end up wrapping up this season, we're probably not going to remember those storms as much as we will a storm like Beryl. Beryl was a storm that came off the coast of Africa. It started as a tropical wave and came all the way across. But again, we don't normally see those start to form until peak season, August, September, and somewhat into October as well. So hopefully that kind of answers your question there. A lot of the storms do end up coming off the coast because those tropical waves, they start out as storms over Africa, and then they end up, moving out into the Atlantic and developing into something stronger. So, hey, I don't know, Hank, Rebecca, do you have anything more to add to that one?
Well, I would just say, for us here in New Orleans, I actually went back. It's interesting because those are the ones, like that question would indicate, that a lot of people focus on. And I think those are the ones that really get, and also because they're out there for so long. I mean, look at Beryl. We were watching this thing for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
It's like how much, and that's why I almost hate the, all the satellite era and all that, because you're talking about these things so early, everybody gets burned out from them. But last year, I went back and checked a certain longitudinal point, sort of east of, sort of in between the Windward Islands and the Cape Verde Islands, as you mentioned. If you get east of that point, New Orleans, for my purposes, over the past 100 years or so, has really only seen about 4 storms that started out there make it all the way across. And so, and come within 60 miles of New Orleans here in southeast Louisiana, southern Mississippi, something like that. So, those I think get a lot of the headlines. As you said, they're bigger. They take up a lot of space. They look awesome. The satellites are so well defined. I mean, these are the big headline grabbers, but at least for, the northern Gulf Coast, we don't see a whole lot of those develop way out there and make their way all the way across. And you think about the past few years, the real intense storms nearby here, like a Michael, like a Laura, like an Ida, a lot of those have formed in the Caribbean, in the Gulf, maybe the Western Atlantic, around the Bahamas, even going back to like a Katrina or something. And so I always try to, focus people more on, hey, it's the ones that are developing a little bit closer in. Not that you can't get one to come all the way across, obviously, Beryl just did. But it's a lot of times it's the ones that are forming a little bit closer in that concern me more, simply because, you're so far out there, so many things can happen. Steering
There's
currents.
so many places for it to go.
It's so many places for it to go. If it's starting on the northern side of the Yucatan and moving north, northwest, northeast, I mean, there's only so many places for it to go. So those are the ones I think are more concerning, at least to me.
Yeah, I agree, because, we have so much time to watch a lot of those storms. And as this map shows you, a lot of those do recurve before it hits any sort of land. So, they do get a lot of attention because we talk about them for a very long time. But it's definitely not the only place that we see those storms develop. I do want to talk about and kind of bring up some of the patterns that we're in right now, because, a lot of people wondering when we're going to start to see that activity develop a little bit more. And our chief meteorologist here at WFLA kind of made this graphic and did a little bit more research on what kind of climate pattern that we're in right now. And there's a very big pattern at the moment where we're seeing a lot of sinking air over where we see these storms develop. And sinking air, not conducive for those tropical systems to develop, because thunderstorms, they grow up, right? They grow taller, but sinking air will kind of suppress that activity and not allow any more storms to form. But as we look ahead to the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, this batch of rising air is going to cross the Pacific and move into our area, move into the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and that's what's going to replace the sinking air that's there now. So it does look like early to mid-August, we'll start to see the tropics kind of wake back up a little bit more. And guys, this is not uncommon for this to happen, because when we look at our average tropical map, you actually see there's a little bit of a dip in that activity for the last 2 weeks of July. We see a little bit of an uptick and a little bit of a downtick before, obviously, a giant uptick in that activity when we get into peak season.
Is that MJO based? Is that what he's doing there?
I believe that is what he was looking at with that rising air kind of moving into our area.
That's interesting. I've talked about that some on air over the past couple of years now. I think even on this show last year. It's tough to get into the technicalities of it. And frankly, I'm not that smart. I don't even know if I know all the technicalities of it. I'm certainly not going to try to get in on it in a 2.5-minute weathercast. But, the MJO, Madden Julian oscillation, has really, at least to me, come to the forefront over the past couple of years. And that graphic's just a simple explainer to show the concept of it. You look at Beryl, obviously was a strengthening system at landfall, but didn't quite get its act together coming right off the Yucatan. There's different factors with every storm, no two are alike, obviously. But when you have the favorable zone of that MJO come into play, and I mentioned some of these big storms over the past couple of years, everybody, wants to say what is going on with these last, sort of these rapid intensification storms closer to the coast where we used to not have that as much. And I think it's simply a function a lot of times of that exact process, this Madden Julian oscillation, which, even the chart's hard to read. Like, I'll sit there staring for 20 minutes and try to figure out what is happening in the next week, because they make these charts so goofy to read. But Laura, Ida, Michael, I mean, all those rapid intensification storms were in that phase. Not that you can't get a strong storm without it, but, once we get into that phase where if we're in the Gulf and that phase is coming overhead, then that's really where it's like, hey, anything that pops up, this has a chance to get real.
I fully appreciate you talking about the Madden Julian oscillation and the knowledge that comes with it, because I completely agree. I gave credit to our chief meteorologist because it is an incredibly difficult thing to kind of comprehend, and the charts to read specifically. Completely agree, Hank. We're going to leave that to, the researchers. And I think that social media has allowed that term and that oscillation specifically to come about over the past couple of years, which has led us, broadcast meteorologists to have to talk about it a little bit more and understand it. But certainly completely agree with you that a lot of these bursts of tropical activity are coinciding with it.
Yep.
And it's important to talk about. But yes, for the average viewer at home to understand it, I mean, for me to understand it is a little bit more difficult. So yeah, rising air. That's what we simplify it down to here on Tracking the Tropics. And that's what I think we'll continue to keep talking about with it.
Probably a good way to do it. I'll bring in my other guy here. I'm like, you're a young guy. What is this thing?
The charts.
Tell me what number we're in right here.
We'll have to show a chart here. I don't have one prepared for you today on today's episode, but eventually we will.
Next few weeks.
Yeah. You'll the viewer at home, our viewers that are watching right now, you'll be able to understand what we're talking about. It's a very difficult thing to kind of portray, but at the moment, that's what we're calling it.
I've got good news. I have some questions from viewers.
Okay.
I think we can answer.
All right.
All right. And so just reminding you guys, use the hashtags so we're able to see your comments. The hashtags are hashtag Hey Amanda, hashtag Hey Rebecca, or hashtag Hey Hank. And so we're going to toss this one over to Amanda. Are the sands from Africa the reason why storm development has been weak?
Yeah, so thanks, Alex, for your question. Yes, one of the reasons that we are seeing activity being a little bit quieter at the moment is because we have so much Saharan dust out there. Typically, we see these really thick plumes come off the coast of Africa right now, the beginning of the season. May, June, July, we see these thick plumes come off the coast. They are plumes of very dry air. It's dusty air from the desert, from Africa. So it is very dry air and kind of prevents that storm formation. But on average, we do see this activity taper off at the end of July, and that's when we start to focus on those tropical waves coming off the coast of Africa because they have a better chance of surviving without them being surrounded by this dry, dusty air. So at the moment, we like the dust. We'll keep the dust around as long as possible, and that is one of the reasons why we're seeing some of the activity being a little quieter right now.
And then we're going to conclude this episode of Tracking the Tropics. We're going to toss this one to Hank. This is from Darlene on our WFLA Facebook page. Everyone is talking about a prediction of a busy hurricane season. In the past, have these predictions proven to be accurate?
That's a great question, and I personally hate the predictions every year myself, simply because, unless you get hit by a hurricane, it probably doesn't matter to you. But they actually have been relatively accurate over the past few years. Now, last year, I think a lot of people, last year was that classic El Nino year where you got a couple of storms that made landfall, certainly as you guys know, but a lot of them were curving off to the east, but there were still a lot of storms. We ended up with a high storm count last year, which, was a prediction. And over the past few years, we've been seeing these active predictions for most of the seasons. But if you look back over the past 3 to 5 years, most of the seasons have been fairly active. I don't know if I agree with, like the world is coming to an end prediction of this year, simply because you're putting yourself so far out there to, achieve these numbers. And you think back to the year we had Ida, and before that, Laura and Delta. I mean, those were record-setting years that there's only been a couple of years like that. I mean, back to 2020, back to 2005 with Katrina and those. Rita, they don't come around often. And so there's a lot of indications that this year could do it. I just don't know if I like the predictions calling for that because so many things have to come together to get to that point. But we do have warm water. We are still expecting that La Nina to develop. You're just dealing with a lot of different factors that may prevent these numbers from quite getting there. But I'd still lean towards at least 20 to 22. And, most of the time, those at least in the past few years, those conditions and those forecasts have been pretty accurate simply because we can measure everything so well now. The modeling for the El Nino and La Nina is not always perfect, but it's been pretty good over the past few years. We can measure the water temperatures and all that. So, they've been pretty reliable for what they're worth.
Yeah, with that being said, and that answer to that question, Hank, before the episode, we were kind of talking about the messaging going into this season, and you have the same message regardless as, most of us meteorologists do. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, regardless of how many storms there are, you have to be prepared because as we just saw, there's two main messages I have every year is that A, get prepared, obviously have your supply, have plans, know where to go, save some money if you can, which I understand this economy that we're in is very tough to do, but at least try to have some to evacuate with. But the other message that I think is important every year is just don't try to compare storms and don't focus on, listen to your local media outlets, whether it's radio, whether it's meteorologists, trained meteorologists, in your local media outlets, and listen to what they're saying about the impacts of the storm versus the category, because it's just human nature to see a category and I know it happened with Beryl, where people just said, oh, category 1, that's not a big deal, as opposed to listening to the impacts. A strengthening storm, I'd much rather have a weakening 2, mid to high range 2, than a strengthening high end 1 like we saw with Beryl, because you just see the impacts of that energy when it makes landfall. Now that's landfall. Storm surge is different. Storm surge has to get built up over time. So if you got a storm out there for 3 or 4 days at a 3, if it's weakening to a 1, you're still going to have that high surge. That's a little bit different. But just in terms of the energy, power outages, all that, those categories, it's only based on wind. It doesn't take into account necessarily the energy these storms are building up. It doesn't take into account the impacts. I'd like to see some sort of hurricane system that takes into account storm surge when you're talking about ratings, that takes into account, you think about tornadoes. We look at tornadoes and we go out and survey the damage, and that gives the tornado classification. You have 2, we have 3 based on how bad the damage was. We don't have that with hurricanes. It's specifically wind-based. And so I think it would be, in this day and age, and credit to the Hurricane Center, they've done a lot of work on social sciences, and they've put the cones out earlier now, and the potential tropical cyclones and storm surge watches and warnings. But I almost think that they could really get on the boat instead of missing it, to do more of an impact-based category system as opposed to strictly the wind, and because it's human nature to focus on those categories. So I always tell people, if you don't take away anything else from a forecast or what we're talking about, if we're doing weather presentations or whatever, treat each storm individually, focus on the impacts that your local officials and meteorologists are talking about instead of that category, because they're all different. And the category doesn't do them justice most of the time as to the impacts that you could see once they get to you.
Always appreciate your insight and your expertise on the show here, Hank. Thank you so much for being our featured meteorologist this week. Hopefully, the season will stay a little quieter this year than what is predicted. But yes, I completely agree with your messaging that we all need to be prepared. It is more than likely we're going to see several named storms heading into peak season here, and several strong storms. So our main messaging, Rebecca, as well. Get prepared.
Absolutely. And tune into Tracking the Tropics.
Tune into Tracking the Tropics. Thank you again, Hank Allen, for joining us today, Chief Meteorologist there at WGNO. Of course, thanks, Rebecca, for joining us today and hosting as well. And we will see you next Tuesday right here on Tracking the Tropics.
Find Tracking the Tropics on these platforms. And for storm updates, the latest models, and helpful resources, visit trackingthetropics.tv.